Go. We are in the middle of the third letter. I just want to back up a couple of lines, which I'm sorry, I don't know how to identify this. In the standard print of the Tanya, it's 4 lines from the bottom. It's the quote reads, and this is what our sages say, that reward for mitzvahs in this world there is not. Something like that. Hopefully everybody can find that. And it's a couple of lines. We did it actually last week, but just to get a little running start and to talk about that in a little more nuanced detail before we go forward. Okay, so remember that we're talking about 2 important vocabulary words, makif and panimi. These are sometimes used or referred to as soivev and mamale. And makif and panimi is that which surrounds us, which we can't identify it. It's very influential. It cannot be bottled. Panimi is very personalized. It's very specific and particular, and therefore it's much more easily appreciated. However, it is not very accessible. I'm sorry, it is only that which is accessible to us, and it doesn't take us beyond what is accessible to us. It's very square pegs in the square holes and round pegs in the round holes. And the influence of the makif, which is the all-encompassing, can have a far greater influence on us and in the execution of Hashem's will, even though it's not something that we can grasp with our hands. And it's really one of the key points that Hasidus hammers home about the opportunity to incorporate the makif into our lives. And essentially the argument that we're making here, and we recognize this from other areas in Tanya, that when we do a mitzvah, we are affecting or implementing better, the Ratzain of Hashem, the will that drives Hashem to create this world. And we all recognize this term, that God created the world because he had this passion for this physical world, warts and all of its flaws, to be a place that welcomes godliness. Dira b'tachtenim, the dwelling place in the lowest of the worlds. We've heard this many, many times. Dwelling place in the lowest of the world. Dira b'tachtenim, dira b'tachtenim. You'll recognize this phrase. So even though I may not sense what's the big deal, how is it that I have somehow done something so wonderful just because I shook the lulav, ate the matzah, put it in the mezuzah? That is in part because of what we say here. This is what the Gemara means when it says schar mitzvah, the consequence of the mitzvah, b'hai alma, in this world, leket is not here. Now, the standard interpretation of this phrase is that we don't get rewarded. And as we know, the Pirkei Avos, we cannot understand why the righteous appear to suffer and the wicked appear to be at peace. So the standard interpretation is I do a mitzvah and I don't see that I get any kind of physical reward. I don't see that I have wealth. We know that there are people who are righteous and do all the mitzvahs, and yet they suffer, and so on. Chassidus here in Tanya adds a whole other level of understanding to this phrase. The idea of the schar, the consequence of the mitzvah, doesn't fit into this world. And this addresses a common challenge. Why is it so important that what I eat or that I say a bracha or any of the mitzvah actions that we do that don't appear to make that big an impact? To me, that doesn't seem like what's the big deal? Why is this so important that I should do this mitzvah? So our explanation is right. This world cannot understand. It cannot appreciate. It's not in this world because it's the quality of the makif. Now, again, we have used other mashalim, other analogies to illustrate this point. When we talk about the different nuances that make a family special, that make a business special, so somebody else is the competitor going, oh, so the whole big thing is that they have this slogan, get me a slogan, or they have this mascot. So they go and they try to emulate it, but they're emulating something without understanding the full-on depth of it. Many people are familiar, it's a longer story, with the metaphor of the rich man who rings the bell and then the servants come and they bring the food. So a guy thinks, that's what I want the bell, I want to ring the bells. Well, ringing the bell only is important when it's tied in with something greater. So again, we don't appreciate, and this world is incapable of appreciating, what it properly, effectively triggers in a positive way when it does mitzvahs. That our mitzvah observance has this kind of impact that goes way beyond anything that we as mere humans in this physical world can imagine. So when we say the value of the mitzvahs, the reward of the mitzvah, we're not just talking about the physical reward and why it is that if I do mitzvahs, I may still not have all the pleasures that I seek. And then again, the common pushback to that, not in Hasidus, is, well, when you get to heaven, then you're going to have all the good stuff. And our understanding is because we don't have within our limited ability the capacity to incorporate the infinite. So it's not like, oh, but there's a better pleasure for you waiting somewhere else. It is the impact that the infinity of Hashem has on our identity. So this is what we mean, because this world is identified by its gashmis, it's physical. It is limited. And what can fit into the limited world is only that which is limited. And the limitation reaches down into the core essence. It's very, very intense. That's the closest translation. It's a very, very intense tzimtzum to create this world. So the world is not a keli for the true on infinity of Hashem. It has to be squeezed into the spheres. It has to be given to us in measurable format. And this is one of the gifts that Hasidus does. It takes concepts that are innately associated with the infinite, and it starts to put them into compartments, which on the one hand is a little bit of like a killjoy. You know, it's like a person who is giving you a accurate yet very mechanical description of something incredibly intense. And there's not just like, wow. Instead, it's this very precise description. Well, on the one hand, that makes it very useful. Concurrently, it also makes it very restrained and very mechanical and basically a little borderline boring. Well, the spheres allow us some degree of appreciation of that which we are describing. And therefore, the kind of only way that the infinity of Hashem can make its way down to us is following through the process of the spheres, and that's why the spheres are called the body. Now, this is a reference to the spheres mentioned in the Pasach Eliyahu. If you look in the Siddur, on Friday before Mincha, we have the minhag to read two Kabbalistic readings, Hoidu and Pasach Eliyahu. Pasach as in opens, which is a reference to Eliyahu Hanavi. And the corollary between the spheres and the body that he references there is that the spheres are to the light like the body is to the neshama. Meaning even the level of Atzilus, although it's the first of the spheres, it's the loftiest, it's the least restrained, it's the most essentially expressive of all the spheres, it's still identifiable. And anything that you can identify is not going to be Atzmis. That's the no thing of Hashem that we always talk about. So anytime we can put a label on it, what is Hashem? And that's the trick question. If we start saying, well, Hashem is, now we already have crossed over the line and we have started to identify Hashem with things. Now, this was, again, the big challenge that Hasidus came to, or one of the big challenges that Hasidus came to address. Prior to Hasidus, we only talk about Hashem is infinite, 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 but it was so infinite, it was irrelevant. It's like if I tell you, there's 1,000 things you have to fix. I can't fix 1,000 things, so why even fix anything? It's not even worth starting with. So we started to break it down and put it into manageable pieces. Now, there was a concern there, as we have talked about many times, that you're going to make Hashem a little too accessible. You're going to make Hashem a little less mysterious. And therefore, there was a fear that it would start to become a little casual. We start talking about Hashem like we're talking about our friend. We get a little shaky there on that experience. And so Chassidus, really has to sort of play this very delicate balance between making Hashem available to us and not making Hashem a little too available to us, as we mentioned. So now we start to break down the spheres. So first we say Chesed, the Rei Yamina. Chesed is on the right side. So again, we get real particular. And again, it's so embedded in the study of Chassidus that we may not recognize how revolutionary and how much of a, like we say in Hebrew, a HaKodesh, how innovative this was. When we start talking about real specifics, last week in the Parsha, yesterday we have about the Chukim, and we start to categorize mitzvahs. These are the Chukim, Mishpatim, and the testimonials. The mitzvahs that are logical, the mitzvahs that defy logic, and the mitzvahs that are attestations to historical events. But then when you start trying to get real nitty-gritty and say, okay, which ones fall into which category? It gets a lot more hazy. Is that a logical, or is that an attestation? Is that logic, or is that something that is beyond logic? It's a chok. It gets shaky as we try to get real particular. Well, Chassidus, based on the Kabbalistic writings, it's not something that we're just doing innovatively, but we're bringing it to the people, which is one of the things that Chassidus does. It does make Kabbalistic ideas accessible to people. So we start to get real specific, and we say that Chesed is associated with the right hand. Now, on the surface, this was often understood just to be a way of categorizing it. Conceptually, no different than just saying, well, we'll call these the red ones, and these the white ones, and these the blue ones. It was just a way of grouping them. Chassidus came down, and again, it's not completely on its own. It is based in the Kabbalistic writings and so on, to get real particular and specific as to why we call it the right hand. We don't just call it north-south. We call it right-left. And the right represents strength, as most people are right-handed. So it's the dominant side. So the dominant side is chesed. And chesed, again, we often translate it as kindness. It's not incorrect, but it really means no limits, boundless. In fact, there's one place in Chumash where the word chesed is referring to somebody who has no more morals. They have no moral compulsion. They're just chesed. They just give it away. Like light, it just lights up everything. It doesn't just light up the nice people and not the nasty people. Or God forbid, an overwhelming flood. It just floods away everything. There's no discrimination there at all. So chesed is like the right side. It's overwhelming. So you say, well, that sounds like infinity. Well, it's not infinity because it's chesed and it's not gevura. Remember, infinite is not everything. It's not all things. Infinite is, again, not identifiable. Once you can start putting a sphera on it, even if the sphera categorization is so subtle, like the most personalized, what we call the highest in the sense of most deeply expressive of the essence of Hashem, of the Chachma, of Atzilus, it's still already a limitation. And any form of limitation is already not Atzmis. And this is where we have to be so cautious. And now we explain. The odd couple of the body and the soul. How can these two get along? And that's why there's often this conflict. Like we say in the Pirkei Avos, we are born against our will. It doesn't just mean that I don't want to go down there and there's traffic and bothersome and cavities and so on. It's that the soul and the body seem to be a total mismatch. How can the body and the soul ever coexist and ever function? It seems completely to be a total and absolute mismatch. The same is true with trying to squeeze the infinite Hashem into the spheres, which of course is exactly what we do. How could you do that? That makes no sense. Well, there's nothing that makes less sense than squeezing a soul into a body or squeezing an infinite Hashem into this physical world. So again, back to a common pushback. Some people might say, why would Hashem care if I eat meat after milk or milk after meat? Well, who cares? And again, what we're basically projecting is saying that I don't care. It makes no sense to me, so I don't care. We, though, would sort of double down on that and say, why does Hashem care whatever I do? Why does Hashem care enough to create the world? Meaning, what the world is not a given. Hashem decided to create the world. What is the prompt that Hashem decided to create the world? So at one point we give up. We say, look, we don't know. I mean, lahavdil, even within the scientific world, they want to say, look, we can't go any further back than that. That's as far back as we can go, even if we want to take them at their most honest level. They want to say the Big Bang, what created the first particles? They say, look, we can't be bothered with that. It's not something that we can know. We only can go back to a certain starting point, just like in every story. Why did you, I don't know, move into that house? Well, in the beginning, God created Adam and Eve, and then that led. Okay, well, we don't have time for that. Just say, well, I live in this neighborhood and this, and therefore it matched my circumstance. So by trying to press the infinite neshama into this body, we can similarly see or map, that's maybe the better word, how Hashem presses the infinite godliness into the spheres, which are also excuse me, bound and limited. Just like the body limits the soul, so too the spheres are limiting the infinite Hashem, the infinite Hashem. Okay, ki afilu chachmi ilah, even chachmi ilah, which is what we hold to be the highest, mostest, uppest, toppest. We can't even describe what it is, but we can call it chachmi ilah. Once you call it chachmi ilah, once you put a name on it, you completely take it out of the infinite. It's a curious point, just relevant to yesterday's parsha. So Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav shalom, well, of course, when he says it, you just completely melt whatever he says. You could read the phone book. But when he talks about what is it that makes Hashem laugh, and he describes it's a human hubris. And there's apparently a phrase in Greek philosophy called hubris leads to nemesis. Hubris, we think we're doing something so special. And the classic first example is in the building of the Tower of Babel. They think they're building this tower. Now, we can experience this. You go on an airplane, you look at the tallest building, it looks so tiny. But when you're consumed with the building, it looks huge and it looks infinite because of our small-minded, when I don't mean that in a pejorative, but the sense that we are human. So if I'm standing next to the Empire State Building, the Sears Tower, I'm standing next to the tallest of buildings, it seems huge. But when I'm up in the sky flying on a plane, I fly past it in a moment, it looks tiny. So too, Chachmi Ilah. To us, Chachmi Ilah is like the Sears Tower. I'm standing right next to it, and I see this thing, it seems to be infinite. But if I'm coming at it from Das Elyon, it seems to be pretty insignificant. It has no identity. We fly past it in a moment. It's like if you've ever had the experience, I don't know if this even, it's like from ancient history, you go to a bookstore and you walk past a rack of books and another rack of books, another rack of books. But if we pause for a moment and say, the person who wrote this book, they put their whole life into this book. This person spent their whole life writing this book. I just walked right past it. So to the person who wrote the book, it's absolutely, I'm going to borrow this phrase, infinite. To me, it's insignificant. So Chachmi Ilah is the uppest, mostest, toppest that we see. But from the perspective of Hashem, it's already a finite, limited entity, like the Sears Tower in the Book of My Whole Story. And it is the first. It is like like a physical creation, again, like this book that I just walk right past, or the Sears Tower that doesn't look all that impressive from a 747. This is how even Chachmi Ilah, which is the first, highest, most intense level of the spheros, looks to the infinity of Hashem. So here again, this is the crucial caution that we have to exert and be mindful of as we walk our way through the discussion of the spheres. They are a tool through which we can appreciate Hashem, but they are not the infinity of Hashem. And we run into this issue as well. I mean, you think about a child, what he thinks about his parent. Oh, my mother is the best peanut butter and jelly maker. It's not meaningless, but it is a child's perspective. Now, curiously, the Alter Rebbe here says, like it says, L'Kuti Amarim. But L'Kuti Amarim, we tend to think of as being what we call the book of the intermediate man, the Sefer Shalbenim, the first section of Tanya. However, this idea is not discussed in the first section of Tanya. Instead, it's discussed in Shar HaYichud Va'amunah, the second section of Tanya. Now, you may recall just a little bit of the history that the Alter Rebbe wrote the Shar HaYichud Va'amunah before he wrote the book of the intermediate man, the thinking being that before we can discuss having our relationship with Hashem, which is what the book of the intermediate man discusses, we first need to be fluent and aware of who Hashem is, which is what the book of Shar HaYichud Va'amunah discusses. And so it's not that surprising that the Alter Rebbe here in this letter would refer to the Shar HaYichud Va'amunah as L'Kuti Amarim, even though later we sort of reversed the vernacular usage of these terms. Okay, but that's a technical point. So here we go. So now, based on this idea that whatever we live in within the spheres are like the Sears Tower, and it's like, you know, our limited human perspective, the book and so on. But Ma'aseh tzedakah v'gemach, when it comes to tzedakah and acts of kindness, so the two are similar but certainly different. Tzedakah is a limited function. That is, a person should give 10%, 20%. In today's chitas, it talks about circumstances where a person might have some emergency. So there's an emergency need on the beneficiary or for the benefactor. But ordinarily, it's a mitzvah like any other mitzvah, and it has rules, right? I put one mezuzah on the door. It's not better to put 5 mezuzahs on the door. So there are parameters. Gemilas chasadim, which are acts of kindness, and it later took on a colloquialism to be a reference to loans, whether it's money loans or it's a resource of having items to lend out to people, strollers and wedding dresses and whatever it may be. This is uncapped. So the difference, tzedakah is capped or it is parametered, and gemach is unlimited. That a person eats from its fruits in this world. You may recognize this in the morning davening, right after the morning brachas. We read a Mishnah. It comes from the volume of Mishnah called Peah. Peah means corners, like the word payas, but it's really a reference to the corners of the field that a person is obligated to leave unharvested, and thus the poor can come through and eat from those fruits and so forth. So it says there are certain mitzvahs that when a person does them, they do enjoy the benefits in this world, and they have the fruits in Olam Haba. They benefit both in this world and in the world to come. Now, ordinarily, we said, schar mitzvah, b'hai alma leka, reward for mitzvahs is not to be found in this world because it's too intense, it's too infinite a characteristic for us to be able to appreciate in this physical world. But why is it that tzedakah and gemach do allow us to enjoy it in this world? So again, remember that every time we do a mitzvah, we are effectuating and carrying out God's purpose for creating the world. And again, as we talked about, this ties into that the little bit push me, pull me that we have of mitzvah fulfillment in contrast to Torah study, mitzvah fulfillment, Torah study, mitzvah fulfillment. Which one? And nobody is suggesting one and not the other. There is somewhat of a suggestion that one takes precedence over the other, that there is a greater pull. And the Alter Rebbe clearly comes down in many places in Tanya on the side of mitzvah observance. And again, it's not one instead of the other, and we're not diminishing Torah study or Torah scholarship, et cetera, et cetera. What we are illustrating is that although we may not be able to appreciate it, when we do a mitzvah, we are fulfilling God's will, and therefore we are making this world fulfill its purpose. Now, this is true of every mitzvah. Why is there a specific emphasis when it comes to tzedakah and gemilas chasadim? So again, a couple of things that the Alter Rebbe is going to point out that we'll see, but just to sort of lay it out as we go there. One is, it has no limit. Like we talked about, acts of kindness are limitless. And we find this even within tzedakah. We find an interesting halacha. There is a halacha, and again, our aspiration, the ultimate, is that every mitzvah should be done with joy and enthusiasm. Shake the lulav with joy and enthusiasm. Eat matzah with joy and enthusiasm, etc. Every mitzvah. When it comes to tzedakah, the Gemara says something that on the surface, of course, it makes sense to us. We can appreciate it, but a little deeper digging may raise somewhat of a conundrum. We say that if a person gives tzedakah with a sour countenance, that even if they give the poor man 1,000 gold coins, they forfeit the mitzvah of tzedakah. So we say, yes, we understand that, people should do things kind, and if a person is coming and they're in need, and now they're feeling sort of broken, and the person gives it to them, but they do it in a dismissive or nasty way, it's not nice. But on the other hand, what would you rather get? 1,000 gold coins with a grimace or nothing with a smile? I mean, to use an analogy from my daughter, she says the difference between America and Israel. In America, when you go to check in for a flight, they weigh your luggage. If it's 1 ounce, over 50 pounds, they say, oh, we're terribly sorry, but that'll be, your firstborn and $250,000. Oh, but oh, yes, they're very sweet and polite, but they say, I'm sorry, that's the policy. In Israel, if your suitcase is 20 pounds overweight, they say, you idiot, how could you do that? Okay, just go. So you get to decide, which do you want? You want them to be sweet and kind, but charge you for it? Or do you want them to yell at you and let you go? Okay, so we understand that. So why is this particularly with tzedakah? Same thing, if the person comes to the Seder, I don't want to do this. This is boring. I don't like this. All right, I'll eat the matzah. We don't say that they forfeit it, right? It's not ideal. It's not optimal. But we don't say that, well, if they do that, they have forfeited the reward of the mitzvah. Why? So here we start to understand that since the distinctive gift of tzedakah is that it touches infinity, every other mitzvah is very precise. And yet tzedakah and gemilas chasadim start to touch infinity. Why? Because it is the absolute pinnacle of overcoming my materialistic identity. The core essence, like you remember, of the Nefesh HaBahamis is survival. It's not about being mean or cruel. It's not about harming others. It's about perpetuating myself. That is what drives the animal soul. So the capacity to overcome that and to take from, quote, what is mine and give it to somebody else is an act that is purely driven by the infinite. In a way, like all the chukim. Okay, I might keep kosher because I like the idea of discipline, but why should I not mix meat and milk, but I can mix, fish and fruit? It seems totally random. Okay, so that's because Hashem wants it. Hashem has asked me to do so, and therefore I tap into the infinity of Hashem. Well, with tzedakah, we also have this ability to overcome the most basic elemental drive of the animalistic self, which is, what's in it for me? And therefore, it gives us this opportunity. When we spoil that with the sour punim, so we have, I guess we have effectuated. The guy who's received it has got it. He got what he needed, so he's better off than he was. But the donor has spoiled his opportunity to touch the infinite of Hashem through this mitzvah that is accessible in a way distinct from every other mitzvah, because he has not overcome his absolute self-awareness and self-preservation and, quote, what's in it for me-ism. And that's why he forfeits the reward of the mitzvah for tzedakah, but we don't say that he forfeits the reward of the mitzvah of, like my example of eating matzah, even if he comes to the Seder with a sour pudding and he sits there with his arms folded and like he's got something better to do. So this is illustrates this idea. So now we go back to the metaphor of the coat of mail. So here we go. My son stuck of a gemach. That's the Mishnah that we say in the morning the Mishnah that we read in the morning, Yesh Nekavim. It has these little holes. Al derech Moshe b'levusha elyon hamakif al gufa hey makeim di'etzvira. So remember we said that the role of garments, remember we said it could protect us from the elements like a warm coat, and it also allows us to enjoy the elements like sunglasses. That's my analogy. The Alter Rebbe doesn't say it, so take it for what it's worth. Meaning, if I don't have sunglasses, then I have to just keep my eyes closed entirely. I can't enjoy the sun at all. If I have sunglasses, or maybe you want to say sunscreen, whatever, I can enjoy the sun without it harming me. So generally speaking, the mitzvahs are designed to be rigid behaviors because that allows us to absorb the infinity of Hashem into our life experience. But then it's a little too clamped down. There's a mashal that describes davening at length. You know, amongst Hasidim, there is a great reverence for people who would daven for hours and hours. So we say, well, yeah, but aren't they forfeiting the other virtue, which is to daven together with the community? And this is another big point of tension between Hasidus and the Litvish world. Which do we put the emphasis on, davening with a minyan or davening at late? Then, back and forth we go. So there's an analogy given that imagine a group of people come for a tour of a museum, and everybody starts together and they move through, they see all the different pieces, and at the end, everybody comes out on the other end. So there's a great virtue. It was orderly and progressive. But then we say, yeah, but nobody really appreciated any of the art. Because how could everybody only want to spend the exact same amount of time on each piece of art? Doesn't this person want to linger a little bit longer at this piece of art? And this person is really touched by that piece of art. And this person is really intrigued by the other piece of art. So the orderliness is virtuous and there's a value to it. But it's a little bit kind of sort of restrained. And it's not the full-on experience. So the levushim are very important. The processes and the rules are extraordinarily important. However, we run the risk of them being a little too restrained. And this is one of those things that Hasidim would say, that other people, they're so rigid and they're so calculated. There's no warmth, there's no enthusiasm, and there's no joy. Just an illustration from yesterday's parsha, we say that Balak wanted to destroy the Jewish people. What's the antidote? So Balak is an acronym for V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. So then people say, no, it's not. Balak is Beis, V'ahavta is Vav. Yes, Lamed is l'reacha, but Kuf, Balak has Kuf, and Kamocha is with a Chaf. How could you say that? So say, you know what? If you love another person like yourself, you're not so rigid that they misspelled it. So he misspelled it. But if you love another person, you're not so rigid. So again, we are very particular, and tefillin have to be square and matzahs have to be baked in a certain. But maybe we get a little too straitjacketed. So how do we, balance that out? Like every parent, you want your children to follow the rules, but you want them to develop their individuality. So if we just take off the reins, we're going to get swamped by infinite godliness, and it's going to be too much. So the coat of mail analogy, you recall, has these little holes, and the little holes are little opportunities for that infinity to trickle in every once in a while. And we know this in our own lives, and we talk about it a lot in Hasidus. It's these little reminders, these little anomalies as we go across the plane of all the rules. We get these little blips that, quote, don't make any sense. That doesn't make any sense. It's one of the things about the chukim, right? It reminds us that we're not just walking through these rigid dance steps. We are being receptive to an infinite Hashem. And if we're not receptive to it, we wind up losing it. We get so focused on what we're doing, we forgot about the infinity of Hashem. So the little holes in our metaphor of the coat of mail are those opportunities for the infinity to trickle its way through. Those are the good gaps that allow the infinite of soivev, remember that infinite level that we sometimes forget. Why am I doing this? To seep into the person. And again, ordinarily they're not. There is Chassidus uses an analogy. It's like the mun. Remember the man that fell from heaven. So the man, on the one hand, nourished us. It was ingested personally. And it also had a quality of infinity. It could taste like anything you wanted to. It was, again, one of those bridge ideas. We had it yesterday in Pirkei Avos, the items that were created bein hashmashos, between those last minutes. Why? Because Hashem was running late. So meaning they straddle. They're a little bit of this world, a little bit not of this world. The talking donkey, which is one of them from yesterday's parsha. Why does Hashem have to send the talking donkey? Just, Hashem spoke to Bilam all the time. Because it's a little bit of this world, a little bit not of this world. It straddles both, and this is what we risk losing if we're only absolutely fixated. So the coat of mail metaphor, which has these little holes, which again just physically allowed for movement, otherwise you can't walk. It allowed though for this infinity, but it also allows for a hijacking. It also allows for a vulnerability. Whenever there's an opening, there's vulnerability. Whenever the kid walks over to the nuke and says, "Hi, you want to be my friend?" There's an opportunity for great friendship. It's also for, "I don't want to be your friend," and great risk. So here the Alter Rebbe continues. As we said, to allow it to light up, ulashpia, and to express, or the light for shefa, this abundance, from the right arm of chesed, the length of days, which then feeds into the left side, which is the gevura. Now, this is always a surefire sign of health. And just a few more. All the spheros down the line. We often use the analogy in Torah. The good is the Yidden going to Eretz Yisrael, and they go through the desert, right? This image of going through the desert. So Chassidus explains what is the definition, what is the characteristic of the desert. In the desert, the sand does not cooperate. What's the difference between sand and soil? That sand, every grain of sand is individualized. Whereas with the soil clumps together. The soil then shares its nutrients with the plant with the animal with the person serves Hashem brings rain, the sand, soil, the whole story. So how do we know that this receptivity is something healthy? I mean, whenever you have this receptivity, these holes that allow the infinite goodness, it also allows the bad stuff in. Like all forms of ideas. How do you know if your idea is the next Amazon or it's a new Coke? How do you know if it's a really good idea or it's a really not good idea? Well, one surefire sign of godliness is cooperation. When chesed leads to gevura, and then all the subsequent spheros, that is a sign of a healthy, godly process. When chesed is in battle and conflict with gevura, that is a sign of unhealthy spheros. So this is what we said here. The right leads to the left. It's not competitive. However, and here's, you see there's the two dots and then this harsh break word, to make sure that this vulnerability is not hijacked. It's not suckled off by the chitzonim, these extraneous things, these matters. I mean, when you open it up, it's now potentially vulnerable to being hijacked from something outside of itself, right? And this is why there needs to be the reverence for heaven, there needs to be the support of the community and so on, because otherwise you could come up with some pretty kooky stuff. From this level of godliness that trickles down and progresses down into this physical world, because remember, Hashem makes himself totally vulnerable to us. Hashem says, here I am, these are the 613 things that I want. And it's possible for people to say, look at these things that he wants, right? This is an opportunity for Hashem to be taken advantage of. We start working around even what Nachmanides calls to be disgusting, but within the rules of Torah. I didn't do anything wrong. That is, if we lose the makif, remember the concept of the makif, the ultimate objective, we could lose that. And again, we see, this sort of competitive characteristic and so on. And also down here, to protect the person, and to guard over him, and to rescue him, or shade, hot shade, like hatzola means literally to shade. Mikol davar ra b'gashmis u'beruknis, to protect us from the gashmis and the ruknis, like the coat that allows the air in. And again, enough holes to allow the air in, meaning, God forbid, just like if you would seal yourself in, you'd be protected. And again, not to revisit, but the whole COVID, like, let's wrap ourselves in bubble wrap, but if we don't have any air, we can't breathe. So we can't be so protected that we can't function. So how do we allow in enough air to give us nourishment and enough infinite godliness and enough flexibility without getting sloppy and careless? It's a tricky thing. Like we were talking about before, when great Hasidim would daven until 2 in the afternoon, it's not because they started at 1:30. But unfortunately, that could easily be hijacked. And then we say, well, they're davening until 2, I'll daven until 2. Yeah, but they started at 6 in the morning, not 10 minutes ago. But these are, certain challenges that we have. Lazois for this, or hamakif, v'seisim hanekev al derech mashal. Kiumi bechinas ein soif v'seivev kol almim canal. The soivev comes down to plug in those holes. And again, this is the necessity of community, of your Shemayim, having reverence from heaven. If we don't have those parameters, if we don't have that overarching objective, if we don't have those touchstone reminders as to what are we doing here, we could see it very easily go, off the rails into very unhealthy ways. So to light up this protection, again, the Alter Rebbe does in a way turn to tzedakah specifically. And again, this isn't an appeal, but one of the great behavior modifiers is tzedakah. There's just to share an example, in Crown Heights, they recently built this mikveh. I haven't seen it, but it's supposed to be unbelievable, fantastic, just beautiful and so on. So there's, a family there, the primary donor. So somebody who doesn't know them, he was taking a tour. He said, what prompted you to do this? The guy said, look, what was I going to do? Buy a yacht? That's what happens if you're not doing tzedakah. You wind up, and again, I'm not, picking on the guy, but you wind up in a submersible. You wind up like Jim Crown, driving Porsches on 200 miles an hour. What else are you going to do? Why not? Why not? You start to think of yourself as absolutely invincible. And again, I don't mean to pick on them and so on. I don't know anything about it, but it's just a symbolically illustrates the point. So the mitzvahs remind us of what is the goal here. I mean, you think about this in parenting. You raise your kids, you want them to be, what is my goal here? and so forth. And that's what protects us, like the coat of mail, from going off the skids when we're in such pursuit of the infinity of Hashem. If we don't have this overarching protective quality of makif, of a commitment to the infinity of Hashem, like they would say, you could come up with all kinds of genius explanations why it's permissible to steal, except Torah says it's not. And again, we get real smart at validating and justifying all kinds of very unhealthy behaviors. Now we go back to our original statement that said, mitzdarf in the cheshbon gadol, that every penny adds up to a big number. So we asked the question, well, obviously we know that, right? We know 1 penny, 2 penny, 3, 4, 5 million, 8 million, right? What is Torah teaching us here that we might have somehow potentially misunderstood to tell us that a penny makes a large number? So the specific point that we're emphasizing is this idea of cheshbon gadol. Now, the word gadol, if you plug it into your Google Translate, comes up as large. But in Hasidus, it often is a reference to the infinite, not just big, very big, like we talked about, but infinity. Because big is Sears Tower in the book, but they get flown over in a moment. We get walked past in a moment. So what's the difference between a cheshbon and a cheshbon gadol? An amount and a big amount is the infinite. that as we continuously contribute to bringing the infinity of Hashem into our lives, we continue to focus on the infinite of Hashem. So when people, again, we fall for this, what do you like about Shabbos? Oh, Shabbos is so relaxing. Oh, well, I like relaxing by playing tennis. No, this is more relaxing. No, now we're in a quibble about what's more relaxing or what's more fun or what's more meaningful or what's more purposeful. And we could potentially lose the infinite. And this was one of the real big pushes that the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov, came to reintroduce to the world. And again, you're living in poverty and suffering and so on. It's not about blaming. Is we lost that quality of infinite. Again, my bias is acknowledged. We're here on Yud Gimel Tammuz. We're celebrating the Frierdiker Rebbe bringing the message of infinite. What is the ultimate message of communism? Is the opposite of infinite, because we're going to lock everything down. We're going to control everything. The idea that we can control outcomes is the dismissal of the concept of the infinite. And that's why all dictators and communists, they hate God. Why do they hate God so much? Why do they hate God so much? Because they hate the concept of infinite, because it means there is something out of my control. That's why academia could hate God. That's why governments, again, corrupt academia, corrupt governments, they hate God because God is the ultimate antithesis to I can take care of everything, I can control everything. Like there was a saying that the fax machine helped to bring down communism because they couldn't control the influx of information. Well, the ultimate uncontrollable is Hashem. And that's why there was this hatred for it. And that's the cheshbon gadol, that as we do mitzvahs, and again, we do a mitzvah, we probably all had this experience, it doesn't feel so holy and so infinite, et cetera, et cetera. But as we do, we can cross over that line. And it's a Mesiras Nefesh point. I'm sorry that I'm ranting here, but this is a not uncommon procedure. Maybe you've observed it. People who start along in their journey, and then they have much more markable steps. They start to keep Shabbos, and they start to daven, and whatever it may be. And then they get to a certain plateau. And sometimes they go, this isn't really for me. Or I'm happy where I am. Or they say, okay, now this is my Mesiras Nefesh. So now the boss called and said, but this is the biggest deal. And if you could just come in on this one Saturday, I'll never ask you ever again. Or it's, the sale on this food that's not exactly the hechsher and the kosher and whatever it is. That's the Mesiras Nefesh point. So as long as I'm going along because, and I fill in the blank, it's going to be limited. Then we get to our Mesiras Nefesh point. And again, we're blessed. Our Mesiras Nefesh is not like we're celebrating the Frierdiker Rebbe. It's not the communists putting a gun to our head, but we have our other forms of Mesiras Nefesh, whatever they are. That's where we touch on the infinite. So call pruta, every one of these incremental mitzvahs that we are doing. Gradually, sometimes I'll use this term, boringly, but then we get to a certain point and it tips over that scale. We get to that point and we can touch the infinite. And this is what Hasidus came to sort of remind us. It's, again, a not uncommon phenomena. Guy gets enthusiastic, he goes off to yeshiva and they're teaching him about this law and about that rule and this law. It's like, well, okay, but when I get to the infinite, and it's called pruta gets you to the infinite. Okay. Because Hashem is gadol, and again, gadol usually translates as great or big, but great and big are still limited, like the Sears Tower in the book. We're talking about the infinite. When we touch that infinite level, and again, the Rebbe believed in American Jewry that they're going to touch that infinite level, that we can bring that infinite. What is the ultimate antidote to Balak is chukas. If we'll have the commitment to the chukim, we'll have that commitment to the infinite, to Hashem, that is the ultimate defense against, what we call anti-Semitism. Yes, it's important to write to your congressman and to protest and send reports to the ADL. All good and fine. If we want to truly defeat anti-Semitism, we have to bring the infinite. This is the Rebbe's message about the moment of silence, etc. Ach, mihu agayim liyividus arva shefelim hazagash miutzviras anikraim gufa. So how do we do it? What is what is it that triggers? Not that is the source, but what is it that triggers it to bring it into this physical world through these 10 spheres? Hua yichranal. That is this unity. When we see the infinity of Hashem, when we see the infinity of Hashem, we don't say I keep Shabbos because we see the infinite of Hashem. When we can see the infinite of Hashem, we can experience it here in our human life. And this was, our aspiration. Hopefully, we touch it from time to time. We all feel this desire. Where am I going to see the infinite of Hashem? Especially when I may be going through some difficulties. Where will I see the infinity of Hashem? Shehi toisvis ha'ora v'hashpa mibichinas ora in seif ha'matzeh le'oyim baruch hu. B'yeser says al ha'ora v'hashpa shebitchilas atzias v'shtalshus. This is the additional gift of light and gift from the infinite of Hashem that dispatches it from this highest level more than what we will get even in Atzilus and Ashtalshus. So here's the irony. The Tzemach Tzedek once said that every Jew could be a Rebbe. I'm like, what are you talking about? Yeah, I think I've told this story before. I will try to make it brief. But when I was in the yeshiva in Los Angeles, I went to England for my brother's wedding, and I met this very fine woman. She's live and be well. It's a very sweet woman. Her family is very, very wealthy, but she's sweet and kind. She's talking to me. Oh, where do you go to yeshiva? I'm there. I don't know anybody. She says, oh, Los Angeles. I still remember. She says, I've been there. I stayed at the Beverly Hilton, which is where movie stars. And then she says to me in the most innocent, have you been there? I was like, no. Yeah. Right. In her world, that's where you live, And she wasn't being arrogant this was her world, This was where she lived. So sometimes it feels like, excuse me, I got the wrong one. I'm looking for the introductory level. What are you talking about? I'm going to touch Ein Sof. I can't even imagine Atzilus. And you can tell me I'm going to touch Ein Sof? And the answer is yes. We have the opportunity to touch Ein Sof, even though it feels like Beverly Hilton. I'm lucky I can stay in a Holiday Inn. This is way out of my league. But this is what the Alter Rebbe tells us. And where does it start? It starts to manifest itself through the spheres. Remember, you have the infinite Hashem squeezed into the spheres that go all the way down to us. We think we're going to touch the spheres, which we will, but we can touch the infinite. How do we touch the infinite? So we go back to the origin. Remember the first pasuk, the pasuk that this whole letter is based on. The pasuk says, "V'koiva, a hat, Yeshua of rescue, Bereisha is on his head." So this is talking about Hashem protecting himself from being abused by the nations, protecting the Jewish people. Yeshua miloshem the Yisa Hashem al Hevel al Menchoseh. What does it mean? This helmet of rescue. It's from the word to turn towards. Vayisa, he turns towards. Like the helmet suggests the source, the level that is higher than Chacham, on top of the head. The reason why we wear a yarmulke is there's something higher than intellect. Not just my personal intellect, but higher than intellect at all, that manifests itself down. I mean, again, it's men, not women, but this idea, when you wear a yarmulke, everybody knows who you are. You have affirmed that you ascribe to something greater than intellect, not just my personal intellect. This makes, as you could see, one of the illustrations of its MS is how crazy it makes people. Oh, you're saying you're not scientific. They get nuts when you suggest that there's something higher than logic. They yell and scream. And in some counties, they're permitted to strike you with non-blunt instruments. Who you read this the Shin Ayin Nehoidin Shabazayir HaKodesh. The Zohar describes this as opening up the flow of 370 levels. This is what it does. Tzedakah is like that helmet that opens it up. What is this number? 370 seems to be random. So we explain 3, which of the 300 is a representation of the 3 levels of Chabad, and 7 of 70 is the Midos. It opens up this whole flow when we have that head, when we are committed to something greater than ourselves. I mean, we all know this. Again, intuitively, the obvious example is we teach our children to have certain principles. So how come when you teach them, they don't have dramatic music underneath it and they go, oh, yes, I understand. But then at one point, they sort of make the right decision, and they're the 2 spies and not the 10 spies. They're the 20% who leave Egypt and not the 80% who stay behind. How did that happen? Well, it was through this level of awareness that, right, they did not at the moment say, yes, parent of mine, your wisdom and genius is inspiring. They probably rolled their eyes at you, but somehow it sunk in. Like we say, Yor Hashem Panav Elecha. You recognize this? It's part of the Birchas Kohanim. When the Kohanim say it on Yontif, we cover our face. When the Chazan says it on the weekdays, we look at him because we want to have the face shining at us. How do we get Hashem's face to shine at us? Just like another person, when we connect with the very essence. Meaning when I go to the grocery store, I just have the guy check me out because that's all I want. I want to get my loaf of bread and my bananas and move out. I'm not interested in this facial thing. But again, talk about makif, people who make legitimate eye contact, people who have this proper sense of rapport, and so on. Hashem should shine his face towards us. Itanu, meaning how do we get that? How do we get that level of attention from Hashem? It is Aidei Maisat Tzedakah, through the concept of tzedakah. Why is it? Because again, it is innately overcoming the most baseline level of self. The basic level of the animal is protect myself. I got to protect myself. The message of tzedakah is overcoming that. I have to protect myself. I have to make sure I have, and then I'll maybe venture out very cautiously. Just like we know this socially. If I'm only concerned with myself, the story people have probably heard, a woman asked the Rebbe, how do I have friends? I have no friends. The Rebbe said, next time you get up to get yourself a drink, get a drink with somebody else too. Meaning, if you'll think about other people, you'll have this. That's a form of tzedakah. It is, I change my whole perspective to think about others and how can I be of service to others. This is the whole transformation. This is what we mean when we say, if you plant tzedakah, you blossom, you reap, you blossom, rescue. Similarly, it says that Hashem will shine his face, righteousness will stand forever. V'karnam torum b'Yeshuas matzmiach keren Yeshua tzemach tzedakah makavei Yeshua hanal kenefesh nidashenim. Again, all of these references to planting, that is, we do the planting, just like when we plant tomatoes, and then Hashem, I mean, you think about it, it's so, you take a little seed, you put it in the dirt, and sometime later, there's fruit. I mean, that's kind of nuts. We're so accustomed to it, maybe it doesn't catch our attention. But I've talked about this before, you say that bracha, motzi lechem in hearts, bring forth bread from the earth. So too, we plant, it doesn't always immediately have that payback. And then we get the Yeshua. What's the Yeshua? Is to be connected with Hashem. That is the ultimate rescue. Again, and I'm not here to criticize just because it's popular. Otherwise, we wind up in submersibles. We're seeking some connection with something greater than ourselves. We're chasing after something greater than ourselves. That's what our neshama is designed for the soivev, that makif level. That's what we're chasing. And we think it's over there instead of understanding that it comes from within and us overcoming our lockdown self. And again, we get the 3 of the intellect to the 7 of the character. Even though they're following along methodical, boring activity, they wind up with this infinite. And again, the planting also requires a patience. And that patience is what can be frustrating. That's what gullus is. When in Gan Eden, there was instantaneous consequence. You planted, you reaped. Why not? Children are naturally impatient. Okay, we have to teach them to be patient, but there's a certain virtue to that. Why not? I did it. Where's the result? I did it. There should be instantaneous result. And when there's not instantaneous result, I get appropriately frustrated. So now the Alter Rebbe is taking us back. Again, the Alter Rebbe is speaking here specifically about tzedakah. He's going to speak about the idea of supporting Eretz Yisrael. Remember, these were the initial pilgrims who went to Eretz Yisrael, started the Kol Chabad, which continues to this very day. It was really rough times. I mean, starvation and so forth that they went through. And the Alter Rebbe was not appealing to wealthy people where he was in Liadi and in Russia. It wasn't like they were wealthy, but the Alter Rebbe is appealing to them to overcome this innate impulse to lock themselves down. And that's how we come in touch with the infinite of Hashem. And that infinity is the level of Sovek.